fear, the woman in the lab coat said as she led me up the anonymous white hallway. It lights up their eyes. Ever seen a cow facing down a bolt gun? A chicken as it's stuffed through a slaughter cone? They're aware. They know what's happening, and it gives them flavor. It's a messed up truth, but it's just that, a truth. Our test tube meat is good, but it'll never taste the same without God's greatest seasoning, fear of the end. And that's what you need me for, I asked her, feeling vulnerable in my skin-tight bodysuit. The fear? I had signed up for a paid clinical trial for a lab-grown meat producer, but other than a vague orientation-style briefing that left me more questions than answers, I was in the dark. I'd been made to sign a mountain of paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, liability waivers, and who knows what, but for the amount of money they were paying me, I didn't really care what I would be lab ratting. I was a broke college student, after all, and ramen 7 days a week will drive anyone to desperation. That's right, Amelia, the woman said. Essentially, we'll be dumping you in a very frightening simulation. It'll scare the hell out of you, but that's why you're getting paid, right? In turn, we harvest your fear, use it to give our artificial meat an authentic taste. Dr. Moore looked back at me, smiled. She had a good face, a kind face, dark hair, hard eyes, a tough woman, but warm, inviting. Her smile was meant to set me at ease. It didn't. I was anxious, full of questions. I blew a sigh. If you have that technology, couldn't you just fake it? I asked. Or manufacture the fear, or use animals, or something. She chuckled, shook her head. That would be cheaper, and make my job a hell of a lot easier. Unfortunately, Mother Nature fights the goodwill of men every chance she gets. Before I could ask for more, we hit a door, and entered the fear harvest. It was a wide, windowless laboratory, sterile white surfaces, blinding overhead lights, linoleum floors, which looked like clean. A long counter-style desk ran along the opposite wall. It was busy by monitors, desktop computers, and a few lab coat-bound techs hunched over keyboards. The real attraction, however, stood at the far end of the room, the simulation chamber. It was a closed-off, CT scan-like tube with a thick stream of colorful wires, each the size of my wrist, running from the top. The wires coiled around the base, disappearing somewhere into the floor. Darth, Dr. Moore called, a gawky, pimply tech hiding behind glasses the size of VW bug headlights looked up at her. Are we set? She asked him. We're good, Dr. Moore, Darth replied. She nodded, gestured me over to the simulation chamber. She hit a button, and the cylinder split up on a hinge, revealing the gelatinous mold that I was meant to lie in. It'll feel real, Dr. Moore said, and it'll be upsetting, highly distressing. Keeping track of things can be disorienting, confusing to some. The system monitors your heart rate, stress levels, and breathing, and makes small adjustments accordingly, tailoring the experience to make it scarier. You'll feel everything, smell, and taste the world as if it were there. So it's like AI, I asked. She gave me a slight smile. That didn't answer my question. I swallowed. I think Moore must have read the look of raw dread on my face, because she quickly produced a little handle that reminded me of a Wii remote. It was crowned with a small red button. Don't worry, she cooed. If it becomes too overwhelming, you can hit this button at any time, and we'll pull you right out. I accepted the handle, the remote, whatever the hell it was. But even if you can endure it, she continued, and don't need the button, and trust me, some don't. We'll take you out after an hour. I paused, sensing something more there. And what happens if I stay in longer than an hour? She faltered. That won't happen. I could see she was hiding something, willfully ignoring important information that might affect my decision to step into that chamber. I know, but if it does, I asked, slightly uneasy. Don't worry about that, she said with a tight smile. You'll do fine. It was dark and cold in the simulation chamber. I laid in the soft, sticky embrace of the gelatinous mold. It felt like sweaty skin. Amelia, Dr. Moore's voice in my ear, loud, beating out of the chamber itself. You can hear me, but I can't hear you. We're about to initiate the submersion sequence. You may start to feel dizzy, but just try and relax. I sucked air, blew a deep breath. My heartbeat steadily rose from a trot to a gallop, pounding my ribcage so hard I was sure it would bruise. Okay, Moore continued. Here goes. Good luck, Amelia. She began a 10-second countdown that was drowned out as a great thrumming built. It sounded like I was inside a jet engine as it screamed to life before takeoff. After a moment, the great thrum began to fade, just enough for me to pick out more counting. 3, 2, 1. Then I was blasted into silence. It was that abrupt, like a switch was thrown. All at once I was in a quiet, still place. Where was I? Somewhere, nowhere, a black abyss. I looked around. I was weightlessly suspended, floating in the great black nowhere. It was like outer space, but without the stars. The air around me was alive. I felt it move through me, felt it pulling me in a dozen different directions, like it was trying to devour me piece for piece. It was awful. It felt wrong, felt unholy, like the very existence of this empty place was an abomination, and I thought I could hear. But then the world solidified, and I was on the ground, clumpy soil, and dead grass digging into my palms and knees. It felt like salvation after that empty place. I tried to rise, couldn't. The world swam around me nauseatingly. My equilibrium was shot. After a moment of sawing cold air through my lungs, the nausea receded enough for me to take my bearings. I rose to my feet and sucked in the scenery. It was night. I stood in the center of some kind of a clearing, an empty field of dead grass beneath my feet. There were trees behind me. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. Awful black trees. And I knew there were things hiding in those trees, things with sharp teeth and too many eyes. A chill bit through my jacket. When had I gotten a jacket? I'd entered the chamber like a surfer in a seal suit, and had come out in a windbreaker and jeans. They were more ripped than jeans, but what the hell? I wasn't worried about my jeans or my windbreaker. I was worried about the city, the field in which I stood edged to a black river, a rush of terrible slimy waters fighting their way downstream. But no, I saw it wasn't water at all. It was eels. A writhing mass of eels flowing like liquid, churning in on themselves in a great knot of squirming black rope. The river of serpents surrounded the ruins of a metropolis. It could have been any American city after eating a nuclear blast. But it wasn't any city, it was my city. The blackened husks of skyscrapers etched themselves out of the night sky. Smoke rose from mountains of concrete and steel. There was no fire. Fire would have meant warmth, and there was no warmth in this world. It was a cold, dead place. My heart was hammering my ribcage. My stomach fluttered, a swirl with sickening dread. I could feel fear begin rooting me down, paralyzing me in place. Thunder growled somewhere far away, and a clap of lightning illuminated a horror beyond my worst nightmares. Silhouetted it just past the city on the horizon, if only for an instant. It was an emaciated, human-like creature, taller than the tallest skyscraper. All elbows and kneecaps, its spindly, stick-like arms topped by long, clawed hands which hung as narrow and slender as the rest of its form. Its skin was the color of soot, ashy and black, flaking and peeling in places to reveal raw, pink flesh like a burn victim. Encasing its head was a rusted box, the size of a mansion, packed with ventilation holes. From those perforations uttered an earth-shuddering buzz, like a colony of flies devouring a moldering corpse. Deafening, the noise punched through me, rattling my lungs, shaking my bones through my horror-frozen flesh. Then a black cloud exploded from the ventilation holes. At least I thought it was a black cloud. But as it funneled out of the box head and came spiraling towards me, I saw this was no cloud at all. It was hundreds, thousands of dog-sized spiders, winged and airborne, hissing through trembling feelers as they bombed towards me from over the city skyline. The lightning had faded, and with it the impossible box-headed creature that had lent this world its destruction. I was thankful for that. Had I been forced to look at that thing any longer, I was afraid my mind would just drain away. But the thick black cloud was surging closer, and I knew I had to move. I knew I had to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was numb. I was captured in amber, encased in a heavy adhesive that glued me in place. My lungs were collapsing in on themselves. My heart was running faster than any heart should. I couldn't do this. I reached for the handle, ready to press the red button. I didn't care about the money, didn't care about anything other than escaping this dreadful waste world. While I still held my sanity, the handle wasn't there. A desperate whimper rose up my throat like a slide flute. I frantically patted down my pockets, scanned the ground around me. There was no handle. There was no red button which would yank me from this nightmare like a bleeding alarm clock. I was trapped, the horde of flight spiders closing in. Almost here, I could hear a shrill chittering pulsing out of their bulbous, hairy bodies. their delicate, housefly-like wings trembling and beating, carrying them towards me. I had to move right now. I tried to remind myself that this was a simulation, but I couldn't. This was real, and I was going to die. And, in the end, it turned out I wasn't far off. So in that moment I dug deep, deep into my lungs. I sucked air into them, and boiled that air into a roar. It was a war cry, a declaration of survival. It shot from my lips, and with it a surge of energy blasted through me. I turned and ran. I had been right. There were trees behind me. The field was hemmed by a wall of black woods. They were like soldiers of the night, lined up for battle, drenched in shadow. I didn't like it, but I had nowhere else to run. So I ran toward the trees, my legs scissoring, my breath whip cracking through aching lungs. I ran, and I never looked back. The woods were a lie, and I nearly tumbled off a cliff. It was some kind of crazed forced perspective. There was no forest, just a thin line of twisted trees separating the field from the lip of a massive, crumbling canyon. I jerked back as the world disintegrated beneath my feet, clumps of rock pulling loose, and skipping off into the great abyss. I grabbed hold of the nearest tree, stared out in disbelief at the Grand Canyon like nightmare. On the other side, across the mile-wide gap, stood an empty, arid wasteland. A haze of ash hung over the blistered desert expanse. There was nothing but a single building, a brutalist cube of white that looked like a Soviet-era hospital. I recognized it immediately. It was Orion Laboratories, the company I was working for, the producer of the lab-grown meat. The building was dark, abandoned, except for a single light beating out through one of the second floor's rectangular windows. I looked down at the drop and felt my stomach lurch dizzyingly. I hated heights, couldn't stand them, and I was trapped over one, the hissing wave of flight-bound spiders surging closer, closer. That's when I saw the rowboat, sitting up against the tree beside mine. The boat was ancient, made of splinters and rusty nails. Painted in crooked, uneven letters on its single sun-warped oar was one word: row. What the hell? There was nothing to row on. It was empty space, a mile of vast, empty space. But that word struck a chord deep within my subconscious, and I knew exactly what it meant. It was insane, crazy, but I couldn't see any other choice. So I leaned over, hanging onto my tree for dear life, and gave the boat a shove. It rocked, fighting gravity, before tipping onto its belly and sliding down over the abyss. But instead of plummeting, it floated, like it had found an invisible face of water. It rocked slightly, buoyant on nothing. I couldn't move, couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then the boat started to drift, moving out over the drop, floating out of reach. My hand shot out for the oar, and used it to fish the boat back to shore. I hesitated, certain that when my foot hit the boat it would drop like an elevator with a broken cable. But then I heard the rising hiss of those flight-bound spiders, and I was forced into motion. I planted one foot in the boat, then the other. My hands white-knuckled a gnarl of tree roots for leverage, the only thing between me and certain death if I felt the world drop out from under me. But the boat held solid, floating on liquid air that felt remarkably like water. I released the tree roots, pulling a deep, shuddering breath as I relinquished control to the boat beneath my feet. But the boat didn't sink, and I rowed. I made it halfway across the canyon before the cloud of spiders descended me like a hurricane. They hissed down out of the sky, wheeling towards me in an awful cloud. I rowed harder, harder, the other side of the canyon closing in. Wham! A spider hammered into me. The boat yawed dizzyingly, threatening to capsize and send me tumbling down into the abyss. I cracked down on the creature with my oar. It reeled off hissing, its many legs paddling the air. Another replaced it, barreling in like a hell-bent kamikaze pilot. I choked up on the oar and swung like a demon. The spider's body crackled beneath my blow, one delicate wing crumpling in on its hairy form. It floundered off, trying to regain flight, couldn't, and was sent shrieking down into the abyss. The cloud of spiders solidified, yes, solidified, coming together as a massive black wall of bodies in the sky. In one coordinated effort of raw, animal hatred, the wall of creatures came crashing down. It was like the heavens were collapsing in on this ruined world, a solid shadow on an inexorable collision course with my stranded boat. There was nothing to do but accept it. Whatever was about to happen was out of my hands. I sighed, an agonal breath of sorts, a living death rattle of submission. I crushed my body down, pressing myself small. In the boat, I waited to die. My breath was shallow, and intoxicating in my lungs. My heart was beating so hard I couldn't hear anything, couldn't hear the impossible rumble, but I felt it. It throbbed up through the bottom of the boat, trembling out from beneath me. The spider cloud heard it too, and pulled back, withdrawing up into the sky in a chorus of frightened shrieks, leaving me to wait. No, the rumble. I heard it now, ear-splitting, the growl of something huge, something ineffable, and it was rising up from the abyss beneath me. I didn't dare peer over the edge of the boat. I was afraid of what I might see, or what I might not. I was afraid that if I looked down it would freeze me in place, paralyze me, so I straightened up, pulled a lungful of dry air, and I rowed. I rowed like my life depended on it, my oar cutting through the invisible liquid, and pulling me forward. The rumbling grew, the biggest noise I'd ever heard, rattling my teeth, shaking my brain in its pan. It was the deafening report of continents shifting, of mountains rising from the earth, and falling back into it. The boat was jumping beneath me, dancing like I was on a fault line, as an earthquake tore through Mother Nature's belly. I couldn't slow now, I was almost there, fighting invisible waves, riding and cresting hidden waters as I closed in on the other side of the canyon. Once or twice I felt myself lift off the rowboat's seat, certain I would blink and find myself plunging down into the canyon, but I didn't, and I hit solid ground just as the rumbling stopped. I hauled the boat ashore and watched as the canyon bore the biggest thing I'd ever seen. A mass of skyscraper-sized tentacles grew out of the darkness, fingering up into the sky. The spider cloud was still circling overhead. They tried to disperse as the great canyon god rose from its throne. One of the tentacles batted through the cloud, sending hundreds of dead flight spiders raining down into the seam. The darkness accepted the offering gratefully, swallowing the spiders as the tentacles finished off the splintered cloud. I stood by and watched the sky rain monsters. It was Dr. Moore's voice. I had made it into Orion Laboratories, and now stood in the darkened lobby. It was gutted, like a grizzly bear had torn through this place. Claw marks shredded through walls, revealing thick runs of wire and tufted insulation. The reception desk was a mess of splintered wood, completely torn apart, but I heard her voice, belting out through the public announcement system, running on a loop, echoing through the empty hospital-like halls of Orion Labs. It was Dr. Moore, and I wasn't relieved. I was terrified. What she was saying ran my blood cold. "Amelia," she said, her voice urgent. "If you're hearing this, I need you to listen closely. This is not a drill. This is not part of the simulation. There's been a problem. We can't pull you out. The computer, there was a malfunction." Her voice was laced with fear. Yes, the hardened woman who I thought could take anything sounded terrified. I promise we're doing everything we can to get you out before 3 o'clock, she continued. I looked up at a shattered wall clock. I was 2:58. I had gone into the simulation at exactly 2. I was nearing the dreaded hour. But if not, I need you to listen to me. There is a replica of the simulation chamber in room B13. That's upstairs. If you can reach it, you should be able to manually send yourself back. But if you, she trailed off, couldn't bring herself to say the words. But if you don't, your conscious mind will assimilate itself into the simulation, slowly at first, starting just past the hour, but it gains momentum rapidly, like a snowball racing downhill. Your body on the outside will live, but you'll be fried, a vegetable, brain activity nil, and you, the real you, will continue to live on in the simulation. If we turn it off, it'll kill your conscious mind. If we restart it, it'll be the same. I hope you're hearing this. I pray you make it in time. Godspeed, Amelia. The clock hit 2:59. I tore a fire map off the wall and ran like hell. It was a blur of anonymous white hallways, a maze of identical corridors. The fire map led me up a flight of stairs, past a dead exit sign, past a doorway barricaded with stockpiled chairs, and down another hallway. A ticking clock seemed to chase me as I went. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I hit room B13 and slammed into an exact copy of the laboratory that had sent me here. The room was pristine, bathed in blinding sodium light. My gaze caught a wall clock, 2 hours, 59 minutes, and 48 seconds. I had 12 seconds. I didn't feel myself move, but I did. I pounded over to the simulation chamber, hit a button. The chamber split open on a hinge, revealing the gelatinous mold. 5 seconds. I climbed in. I was crying now. Tears, hot and salty, cut warm lines down my cheeks. 3 seconds. I laid down and pounded the button. The chamber sucked shut, sealing me in. 1 second. I was immediately swallowed in the great, powerful hum that indicated my transgression from the simulation. It built and built until it was unbearable, and just as abruptly cracked into silence. Deep, deafening silence. After a moment, the chamber yawned open with a hiss of hydraulics. Harsh light blazed in and seared my eyes. Dr. Moore's voice greeted me. "Amelia," she said. A wave of relief washed over me like rapture. The giant that had been sitting on my chest stood up and walked away. I staggered out of the chamber, looked around. I was in the empty laboratory. Dr. Moore's voice piped in over the public announcement system. "If you're hearing this," she said with that same terrified urgency, "I need you to listen closely. This is not a drill." I looked up at the clock. It was 3:01. There was a malfunction. Your conscious mind will assimilate itself. Starting just past the hour, your body will be fried. Your mind will live on in the simulation. I stood in the empty laboratory, trapped in the nightmare, listening as Dr. Moore spelled out my fate, and watched the clock slam 3:02. Silence slapped me in the face. It was immediate and startling. Moore's public announcement loop had cut out. Mid-sentence, I think, though I can't say for sure. I hadn't really been hearing it. But now that her voice was gone, I missed the company. I felt alone, like a long-lost boy stranded in stormy waters, carried further and further from land by the whims of an angry ocean. I couldn't think. I sucked air, hoping a lungful would burn away the fog that had settled in over my mind, hoping I could force myself into a plan of action. But who was I kidding? I was out of my depths, shipwrecked in hell. Why'd I think I could do this? Why'd I think I could? Dr. Moore's voice jolted me out of my head. "Amelia," she said. I flinched, startled, then relaxed, anticipating a repeat of the same SOS she'd given me before. But it wasn't the same message. It was a new one. "You're not back," she said, "which means the link between the two simulation chambers is severed. I promise we're working like hell to bring you home. If you burned all the Ivy League degrees in this room, you could warm a developing country." Her trace of spirit was meant to cheer me up, but all it did was tug on my longing for the outside. "Every second counts," she continued urgently. "You know that more than anyone right now, and I'm sure watching the march of time is killing you. So here's what you can do. There's a manual marriage switch in the basement. The simulation was built from the inside out, and the developers implemented the switch as a safety net, ensuring that if they ever got caught inside, they'd have an escape. If you can make it to the basement and throw the switch, we're in business." She drew a long, trembling breath. "Be vigilant, Amelia. Be careful. Keep your guard up and your ears open. The things in there can hurt and maim and kill. And remember to." Then the speakers hissed, and the message started over again. The clock struck 3:03. I stood in the nightmare and wished life were a palindrome. There were no clocks in my descent through the bowels of Orion Laboratories. I was in one of those service stairwells that scissors back and forth, economically stacked to fit an elevator-sized shaft. I took the rusty stairs down 2 at a time, guided by the watery beam of a flashlight I'd snatched from the lab. I was nearly at the bottom. I could decipher a massive rust door marking the basement entrance, the kind of door you'd see on a ship or submarine, hinges the size of bricks, a wheel handle like a car tire. I was nearly there. 20 steps, 15, 10, then the smell hit me, punched me in the face. Thick and humid, the ripe stench of a swamp. It was marshy and suffocating. It stung my eyes, scorched my throat like acid. I gagged and palmed my jacket over my nose and mouth. I jerked to a stop on the penultimate landing, forced back by that ungodly reek. I played my light over the sub-level and saw something that flooded me with disgust. An ocean of greenish, stagnant water drowned out the bottom floor. A sort of still, lifeless pond that breeds all manner of awful things, skinned by thick sheets of swamp gunk which drifted like flow. My legs weren't solid objects anymore. They were jelly. My stomach twisted in on itself. My eyes were burning, but I couldn't close them. I was afraid that if I did, I would see the slithering swamp things that were rooting around beneath the water's cloudy surface. No, I fought those thoughts away, prodded them off with a 20-foot pole. Dr. Moore's words replaced them, clanging through my mind. "Every second counts," she had said. "Every second." And I just wasted a whole lot of seconds. I moved before I could lose my nerve, pounded down the remaining stairs, and, without much thought or dramatics, plunged my feet into the rotten water. The runoff, tepid and sticky, rose to my shins, turning my lower legs into slimy logs. It soaked through my jeans, flooded my shoes, swallowed my socks. I cringed at the way it made my legs feel heavier, like they were weighed down by a layer of disease. Wincing, I waded over to the metal door. The thing was made of rust. It was a tetanus factory. Huge flakes of the stuff, as big as my face, were peeling off like dead skin. I planted my hands on the handle without much hope. There was no chance this thing would turn. It would simply refuse, welded shut by rust and time, and then I'd be left to wallow in my own swampy demise. But the handle spun like it had been greased yesterday. Didn't even squeal, the way old metal sometimes does. I slipped the handle in a smooth circuit that was as silent as a gliding paper airplane, and when the handle could turn no more, I pulled. Now the door squealed, shrieked on abused hinges as it shifted open. A rush of egregious water came gurgling out. As the door opened, the smell of swamp slapped me, so violently overwhelming I thought I would faint. It rode the wave of water, choking the stairwell like noxious gas. I reeled back and gagged, folding over as a hot rush of vomit came roaring up. I painted the water and puke. It floated there, joining other islands of filth. Once I was sure I wouldn't keel over again, I wiped my mouth, spit, looked up, and beamed my flashlight at the door. The run of water had slowed to a trickle. It had risen to my knees. If it went any higher, I wasn't sure I could take it. I exhaled, tried to think of nice things. Couldn't. The air was sticky, warm, a hot blanket wrapped tight around my body. I noticed with vague detachment that I had sweated down my clothes. They clung to my flesh like a second skin, or maybe more like a malignancy, trying to smother the life out of me. I hesitated, spit once more, pulled a big dose of swamp air through my lungs, and waded off through the rusty door. There was a forest in the basement. The swamp water, I saw, was a contained moat separating the doorway and the industrial cinder block wall running through it. From a stand of twisted, gnarled trees, it was like a grim fairy tale, an awful place from a blood-soaked fable. The wood within the basement. I stood there, looking at the impossible forest, wondering where it had come from. A soft blanket of fog heaved over damp soil, flowing like a river over knotted tree roots. There were pine trees, tall, ancient things, battle-scarred, but heavy with needles. I was hesitant to advance them. Then I felt something slither by my leg, as smooth and gentle as a lover's caress. I made a horrified sound, and rushed up to dry land, relishing the feeling of firm, solid footing beneath me. I looked back at the water lapping at the cinder block wall and feeding in through the doorway. Nothing moved, nothing that I could see. Anyway, I turned back to the trees and took the view. The forest was real, endless, a sprawling wood tucked into the world beneath Orion Laboratories. There was a night sky above my head. It looked authentic enough, with twinkling stars and an icy rind of moon. But when I pinned it with my flashlight, I saw it was a flat, solid object, like the heavens were, in fact. The basement ceiling 20 feet overhead. It was a cool parlor trick, looked genuine, but I didn't much care. I scanned the area for a switch which might get me the hell out of here. I was met with nothing but trees. Sheets of pine boughs dangled overhead, like bristly fingers. I could feel dead needles crunching underfoot as I moved, like walking on insects. Tangles of forest brush filled out the rest of the world, everything caked in moss and mushrooms and who knows what from an eon of forged history. And it lasted forever, stretched endlessly, as far as I could see. But there was no mother switch, or marriage switch, or whatever the hell she had called it. There was just trees. I learned there were other things, too. I met them just a few moments later. It looked like some kind of terrible doll, 3 feet high, its body loose and jointed, its skin clumpy and uneven like paper mache. I had been moving forward as quickly as I could. The fog masked the ground, and I didn't dare run for fear of wrenching an ankle. Then I heard it, scampering after me. I whirled around, and the doll-like creature stalking me dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. 1 second it had been lurching forward, hurrying along after me, but the instant my gaze pinned it, it crumpled like a sack of grain. It was a loose pile of limbs. Its back, I saw, was bulbous and misshapen, like a small hunchback of glue and clotted paper. Its face was dumb and blank, shelved forehead over dead, glassy eyes, like a sculpture done by the challenged kid in art class. My lungs were tight, swollen beneath my ribs, leaving no room for my thundering heart. I could feel my throat closing up as I inched toward the thing, the horrible, deformed thing, the messed up, inbred homunculus that walked like a puppet but had no strings with which to walk. A forest walker. I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around, leveled my flashlight. 2 more puppets hit the ground. They dropped when you saw them and moved when you didn't. More on my right. I spun. 3 puppets dropped. I looked to my left. 4 puppets fell. By the time I heard movement behind me, it was already too late. The first doll thing grabbed me from behind, sinking the little razors tucked into its molded hands, into my thighs. A bolt of agony lit up my side as the thing began to tear and shred like a kid pulling wrapping off a Christmas gift. I shrieked, tried to rip the doll thing off, but its barbed nails were driven in through nerves, and gristle caught and embedded like fishhooks. I screamed, spun, turned, whirled like a dog chasing its tail, trying to get a look at this thing, trying to get it to drop. Tears blurred my vision. I couldn't see it over my jacket. I was screaming as I reached behind, tried to get a grip on the thing, couldn't. I batted its destructive hands with my flashlight, which only nailed its claws deeper into my flesh. The horde of forest dolls closed in, too many of them, everywhere at once, lurching, staggering, limping forward like small, broken puppets, surrounding me. Dozens, scores, like the misfit orphans creeping out of the damp cellar at playtime. Great waves of them dropped as I spun, and then they'd rise again, and drop once more. I screamed, shrieked until I thought my brain would rupture. Blood warmed my legs, ran down my thighs, and filled my shoes. I was one hot burst of agony. The dolls closed in, like a psycho game of red light, green light, moving when I wasn't looking, dropping when I was. They were going to engulf me, swarm me like an army of ants usurping a fallen beetle. Then I caught my own, pale, pain-torn reflection in the silver lens of the flashlight, my eyes bright and wide with fear, my hair a damp, sweaty mess, and past my own warped reflection, I saw the thing clinging onto me. It dropped like a stone. As its claws tore free, a bolt of adrenaline roared through my veins like I'd just mainlined the stuff. I forced myself into motion, fought my body into a blind, full-tilt crash run through the army of puppets. Razor nails scraped and clawed and tore my legs to ribbons. I fought aside waves of the awful, misshapen things whose skin was so much like poorly molded clay. I bled and I ran. The horde pursued, but their diminutive, stumpy legs were no match for my strides, and soon I had outrun them. I jumped logs, dodged branches, batting them past on my way under. I ran until my legs were cold and aching, and nothing but red. I ran until my lungs screamed, and my heart did too. I ran until I saw the ladder and the big metal switch above it. I stopped, looked up in disbelief. There was a ladder in the middle of the forest, a wooden rung ladder as naked and pristine as the day it was carved, rose in a perfect vertical line from the forest floor to the little twist of moon overhead. Almost looked like it was touching the moon. The ladder was an impossible thing, standing on its own, seemingly unsupported, but so was this world beneath a world. Overhead, the ceiling sky opened up, allowing the ladder to climb at least 200 feet into the air. The sky itself never broke the illusion that it was real, but if you looked long and hard, you could see the seams where the ceiling widened. But I didn't look long and hard. I looked at the switch. It was planted on the pocked face of the moon, pounded in like a flag left by those developers Dr. Moore had mentioned. It was one of those old-fashioned, industrial lever switches you might see a supervillain throw to kill the power to a metropolis. The mother switch, marriage switch, the thing that would save me from this living, breathing, shifting nightmare. But it was 200 feet above the ground, at the end of a narrow, impossible wooden ladder. I couldn't do this. The rowboat had been hard enough, and with that I had been blinded to the drop, able to willfully ignore the state of its existence. But this, every run, every inch, foot, yard, the view of the forest shrinking away from me, all of them would be an evil, unrelenting reminder that I was high, higher than any human was designed to go, to the stars. So I didn't climb, I didn't move. I folded over, collapsed onto a bed of moss, and sobbed into my bloody palms. Climbing was a means of survival, the only direction in which to escape the crooked thing that rose from the earth. It was bigger than me. It had been submerged in a thin camouflage of soil, like those hunting spiders that bury themselves to catch prey. As soon as I hit the moss, the ground beneath me began to shift, break apart. Silently, it was deadly silent. 4 buried sticks, which had been laying in wait like an X, drew together as the monster's abdomen rose out of the dirt. Those were its legs, pulling in on its body as it coiled up to pounce. It was bigger than me. That said, no single part of it was wider than my forearm, spare its head, which was narrow and canine, and wrapped in pale, emaciated, hairless skin, but otherwise it was thin, bony, crooked, its clawed legs the same width as its slender abdomen. It was the stick monster of nightmares. It rose on all fours, drawing to its full 10-foot height. Its eyes, blind and useless, like 2 white marble tucked into its skull. It sniffed, and then it howled. It wasn't shrill, it was deep, guttural, ear-splitting, like bones grinding together. Then it lunged. I screamed, scrambled back, forced towards the ladder. I didn't even think. I climbed, fast as I could, not fast enough. One rung after the next, over and up. The ground pulled away. Wham! The stick monster drilled into the bottom of the ladder. The whole thing shook beneath me, but didn't fall. The tip of the ladder must be driven through the moon, I thought, like a stake through a vampire's heart, supported from above, not below. But falling wasn't a problem. I heard scraping, the click of nails. I looked down. The stick monster was scrambling up after me. I was trapped, with nowhere to go but up. My hands were bleeding, filled with splinters. I scrabbled up the ladder as fast as I could, looking up, never down. I was afraid that if I looked down and saw the forest so far below, I would lose all nerve and just seize up, clam together where I was on wait to die. So I didn't look. I moved, fast, hard, climbing like hell. The stick monster was closing in, tearing up after me, its hooked, sloth-like claws shredding the wood, eating through the ladder, and leaving nothing in its wake. There would be no climbing back down. This better work, it had to. One of the rungs snapped in 2, and I fell. I was halfway to the moon switch when the rung snapped. I came down on it, and it split beneath my hands, with a crackle. And just like that, in one misplaced grab, I had lost everything. I was falling. The ladder was pulling away from me, and I realized that meant I was flying backwards. Time slowed down. I saw the night sky, and realized that it was real, not a ceiling at all. How could I have thought it was a ceiling? Or maybe it was, and this was all just another lie. I saw the creature 20 yards beneath me, clawing up the ladder in a cloud of splintered wood. I saw the broken run fall, tumbling, drifting. I saw myself wheeling out over empty air, only my feet on the ladder to keep me grounded, falling backwards, my hands pinwheeling, my lungs struggling for breath, my vision shrinking to a pinprick, my tongue dry, like an old sponge that hasn't seen moisture for decades. I was falling, and I was going to die for real. No, after all I'd been through, my legacy wasn't going to be a red smear on the forest floor. So I forced movement to my hand. It shot out, and for a sickening second grabbed nothing but empty air. Then I felt the next rung beneath my fingers. Solid wood, splinters cutting up through my skinned palms. But I didn't care. It reminded me that there was something there. I pulled myself in, hugged the ladder for a long while. Then I heard the snarling creature clawing up after me. I looked down, saw it closing in on me, 15 yards behind, bellowing that awful, arid roar. I looked up, could see the moon just ahead, a crescent no bigger than a dining table, simply planted in the starry night sky, glowing with warm, white light. It had looked so much bigger from below. I saw the switch drilled into its surface, waiting for me to throw it. I reached up for the next run when something grabbed my ankle and yanked me back. The stick horror had one clawed hand wrapped around my leg, its snarling, awful jaws snapping up at me. I cried out, no, screamed, anger and pain scraping up through my throat in a raw, powerful scream. So close from the switch that would save me. So close, I didn't think. I screamed and I stomped. Bone crunched underfoot. The creature's narrow legs snapped like a matchstick as I booted. Bone split up through its pale flesh. A warm spray of black blood hissed out, splattered me. The creature shrieked. It shook the world. I thought it would shatter the moon. Then the creature faltered, lost its grip, and fell. Its legs paddled for purchase, trying to find a grip on the ladder, but it couldn't, and so it fell. I watched it shrink, watched it disappear through the treetops. Then I turned and climbed, knowing the stick monster was no more. The moon was cold. It gave off no warmth, just that soft, silver light glowing from beneath its skin like a child's nightlight. I was at the end of the ladder and saw that, yes, the ladder was drilled through the moon's surface. I was eye level with the switch, the one that would send me back. I took a deep breath, pulled a big lungful of air. I gripped the switch and flung it up. Flunk. Nothing happened. A little beat of dread grew in my stomach. I reset the switch and threw it again. Flunk. Nothing happened. I reset and won again. Flunk. And again. Flunk. And again. Flunk. And the world shook, slowly at first, a tight vibration feeding up through the rung ladder, but it quickly blew into a full-blown tremor, a seismic apocalypse ripping up through the world beneath Orion Laboratories. Then everything started to crumble, like a sandcastle under gale force winds. The night sky fell apart in great chunks of rubble, raining down as the world beneath me imploded, like a biblical sinkhole had opened up to swallow the above. It looked like a mouth, as if some ancient beast waking from hibernation had decided to feed. The moon broke apart, crumbled like old rock, releasing the ladder embedded in its surface. Releasing me, I fell, plummeted, holding onto the ladder until that disintegrated through my fingers, and I fell with nothing to hold onto but myself. The wind rushed through me, the ground rushed toward me. I watched the sinkhole swallow everything, pulling big islands of force down into its depths. It was eating them, dissolving everything it swallowed like acid. Then I hit the sinkhole and dissolved too. I watched my hands crinkle and crumple and rot away, the flesh drying in on itself like a slice of fruit under a dehydrator machine. I could feel the rest of myself wasting off, the little beauty I had rotting to nothing, as the sinkhole sucked the life from my bones. Then the whole world went black, and I felt no more. I came to life in a very white place. Blinding light, hot and stark, was beating down. There were sounds, voices, a name, my name, spoken in unfamiliar mouths. The white withdrew like a curtain pulling back at showtime. A room resolved around me. A laboratory, yes, that's what it was called. People in white coats crowded round. Doctors. No, that wasn't right. I was tucked into the corner of the room, rocking in place, knees cupped to my chest, sobbing into them. I realized I was crying, and wiped tears, and snot on the back of my hand. There was a woman fanning me with my jacket, cooling me off. Amelia, she was saying, "You're back. It's okay. Honey, you're back." "Ooh," I started. "Dr. Moore," she said. "I'm Dr. Moore. You're back. We got you back." I looked around and remembered it all. And I was home. I was safe and home. Looking back, I was so naive, so blinded by what I wanted to believe. Little did I know I had left a piece of myself back in that place, or maybe it had installed a piece of itself onto me. Either way, I had no idea, no clue that the real nightmare was only just beginning. I saw my first fracture on the drive home from the nightmare. Fracture, flashes of the nightmare fracturing the real world. If I had listened to the Orion people, maybe I would have been spared. But I don't think so. I think I would have seen things whether I'd stayed behind or not. They had wanted to keep me for a few days, keep a watchful eye on my condition. I told them to screw off. They'd already taken enough from me. I wasn't about to let them have any more of my time. So I took my check and ran. Dr. Moore chased me out into the parking lot, said I'd been through something traumatic and needed friendly faces watching my back. Friendly faces. Laugh riot. Huh? I ignored her, shouldered into my trashy hatchback with mismatched doors and an angry carburetor. She tried to stop me, to get me to listen. I peeled out of there and never looked back. I almost wish I'd stayed. Guess it doesn't matter much now. In the end, life, my ruined, fractured life, led me straight back to the nightmare, straight back into the simulation chamber. Orion Laboratories was buried in the woods just beyond the city, connected to civilization by a winding, two-lane blacktop. The drive was an hour, maybe two, of vast, unending trees. Traffic was sparse, bordering non-existent. Thick woods rolled by outside, a colorful scroll of patchwork greenery. I didn't see any of it. My mind was racing. I wiped sweat. My hands knuckled the wheel, wringing it like it was the neck of my nightmare. And if I could just snap it, everything would be alright. I was thinking back to the things I'd seen, the canyon, and the impossible rowboat, the forest dolls that walked or fell depending on where you looked, the ineffable boxhead who bore those winged spiders. Then I blinked and my world fractured. A shutter click, and I was no longer driving up the forest road. Now I was in a red wasteland, Mars after 500 years of nuclear devastation. Dry and infernal. The sky was a sickly red, gauzed with ash. Twin suns burned through, making the whole thing glow like blood. I was on a cracked asphalt road, a huge, empty lane hemmed by two 50-foot walls of barbed wire. The wire walls were interminable, a coiled, tangled run of rusty razors, sharp enough to cut with a look, stretching as far ahead of me and behind as I could see. Four dangled from the barbs and scraps and tangles, wrenched free of the damned souls that had once tried to scale the deadly walls. This road, the one I drove, was once a footpath that saw an endless caravan of the enslaved driven forth by something ungodly. I don't know how I knew it, but I did. Knew it in the deepest wrinkles of my soul. It took me a while to react, like my thoughts were drenched in a molasses that made them slow to come, and I knew that I was awake now. My mind wasn't trapped in the vulnerable stages of the induced simulation. It felt like if I died out here, I fought that thought away and forced my foot down on the brakes, stomped the pedal to the mat. Only I didn't slow down. I sped up. My car lurched forward, the engine growling as the speedometer rose from 40 to 50 to 60. Then I saw the mountain of bodies, an Everest of limbs, and rotting corpses. Had they been there before? Yes, they must have been. It filled the horizon, taller than a skyscraper, a huge knot of abused bodies, men, women, children blackened with rot, and stacked to the bleeding sky, choking the road in front of me, 100 yards away. Too. No, I hissed, hardly audible over the congested scream of my car. The engine sounded like a sick dog howling at the moon as it was urged faster and faster. I needed to react. I couldn't react. The molasses that had started with my mind now ran down the rest of me, coating me in a sluggish inhibitor, leaving me to watch, eyes wide, skin pale, breath shallow, as I went racing ahead from 60 to 70 to 80. My hands were glued to the wheel, cemented in place. I pried my right hand free and gripped the parking brake, jammed it into position. Nothing happened. My car shot forward, the speedometer rising from 80 to 92. I tried to wrench the wheel to go crashing into the barbed wall instead of that mass of corpses. Somehow that seemed better, more so if I was launched through the windshield and died on impact. I was certain that if I hit the bodies it would avalanche, a million of the fallen dead raining down, collapsing, burying me alive, leaving me to die in moldering darkness. But the wheel was locked, wouldn't budge. The speedometer needle trembled, rounding 90 miles per hour and sweeping towards 100. I couldn't feel the road beneath me anymore. It was a smooth blur whipping by underfoot. My galloping car closed in on the corpses. It was almost like they were moving towards me. 50 yards, 25. So close that I couldn't see the sky above them. So close that I could decipher the faces of the fallen. A woman, rotting flesh drawn back in rictus. The child whose cheeks had slipped away, leaving only a nightmarish smile of moon-white bone. A man missing half his head, a tangle of greenish-black brain dripping out over his face in curly ribbons. My hands were strangling the wheel, gripping it so hard I felt my knuckles burst. Then the corpses came to life. All of them, in some awful, synchronized choir, opened their mouths and honked. It was a deep, throaty trumpet sound that rattled through me, shook the world like an earthquake. I was there. I couldn't stop. My collision course had been cemented, and I clenched my eyes shut as I was about to go drilling into bodies. Then the light changed. I saw it shift behind my eyelids. I opened them and gasped. The world had unfractured, and the angry grill of a long-haul truck filled my windshield. I was on the forest road. I had drifted into the oncoming lane. I was going to die. I screamed. I wrenched the steering wheel. It swung left, sending my car lurching toward trees. For one terrible instant the truck was all I could see, its shadow filling my cab, its snarling grill snapping from my neck. Then I shot off the road. The long-haul truck, whose bed bore the logo of Orion Laboratories, blew past, and then it somersaulted upside down. No, I was upside down. I was weightless. The ground and sky cycled over and up in spasmodic flashes outside my windows. My car spun, flipped, smashed. The windshield bulged, burst, showered me in glass. Blood rushed down my hairline, warm and sticky. I was still going, flying, spinning, free of my binds, unfettered to soar like a bird. I was free. Then my car wrapped around a tree. Glass exploded. I snapped against my seatbelt, bounced my head off my window. I heard a crack like a twig snapping. A light bulb popped behind my eyes. I heard metal scream as my world crashed to black. I awoke in the simulation chamber, strapped down, Dr. Moore looming over me, a devilish smile creasing her pale moon face. I tried to scream and found I couldn't. My mouth was filled with broken teeth and blood. I was choking on it, drowning in it. Amelia, Moore was saying, her voice distant and feverish. Just one more trip, just one more. Then the simulation chamber hissed shut, and I screamed awake for real. I was in my own bed, in my own apartment, and there was someone pounding on the inside of my skull. It must have been my brain. My head was thudding so bad I thought it would explode. I sat up, wincing. Sweat-sodden bedsheets spilled away as I shifted and looked around my tiny studio, pad-bound in raw brick and bathed in blue evening light. The room I never thought I'd see again. I expected more nightmare, but I knew this was real, knew that I was awake and home and safe. I also knew, don't ask me how, that my car would be parked down below, unmolested by the accident. I'd no doubt imagined. Fracture. I dry swallowed 2 aspirin, hesitated, chewed down 2 more. The pounding in my head slowly receded like a morning tide, pulling back until my thoughts cleared and my eyes focused. I needed to do something. I wasn't sure what. I parked behind my computer and powered it up. The laptop's screen stunned my eyes. I cranked down the brightness and called up Google. Then I researched. First Orion Labs, which I'd done before I'd taken the gig, coming up with nothing indicting, and then pounding in random buzzwords. Fear simulation, fear harvest, fear sickness. After an hour of burrowing down a shallow, unhelpful rabbit hole, I killed the computer, just stared at the wall. Sleep was pulling at me, tugging my eyelids down, making them so very heavy. I fought sleep, terrified of what I might see when it finally came. Then I heard the noise somewhere behind me. Bone crackling, joints popping, something ancient rising from rest. My heart was hammering my ribcage. My breath was intoxicating, cold in my lungs. My apartment was dark, wrapped in shadow, the world outside my windows drenched in night. I didn't dare imagine what might be lurking in those black pockets. The noise had stopped. It was quiet, suffocating, and silent, but I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes drilling into the back of my head. My nape prickled with gooseflesh. My hands tingled. My chest was heavy. My lungs were filled with drying cement. I turned, slowly, quietly, afraid that if my chair squeaked the thing would hear. I turned and my apartment was empty. Bed by the window to my left, kitchenette to my right, door just past the kitchenette. Deep pits of shadow claimed the edges of the room, sucked out all the light. I relaxed, exhaled. Then I saw the crooked thing in the corner of the ceiling. A knot of limbs, crooked and jointed, perched like a giant spider on my periphery. My head inched up and over, my eyes finding the ancient woman perched on my ceiling. She looked like she was made of wire hangers, wrapped in wrinkles and leathery skin. Her hair was straw thin and gray as ash, hanging like vines from a lumpy, scabbed scalp. I couldn't see her face. Too many arms and legs sprouted from her narrow, crooked form, all of them jointed and odd, bent in places, and ending in arthritic, claw-like hands, which were planted on the ceiling and holding her in place like a giant spider. She was still, deathly still, like a statue. My terrified heart was beating its fist against my chest, trying to break free of its rib-wrought prison. All I could hear was hot blood roaring through my ears, watching in unbearable dread as the lifeless old woman clung to my ceiling like a rotten insect. She moved so suddenly and abruptly that I screamed. Her limbs pumped and crackled as she skittered across the ceiling to the spot right above me. She stopped, directly overhead, hung there for a moment. I couldn't see her face through her spray of gray hair. Then she dropped like a spider, plummeted down out of the sky, and I saw her face. Oh God, I saw it, and it was wrong. No, it was evil. It was crooked and broken, and wrinkled and wrong, and it was snarling for the hot blood rushing through my neck. I woke up screaming. Morning sunlight was slashing through my cloudy windows. My apartment was empty. Someone was pounding on my front door. I knew who it was even before I forced myself awake and pulled it open. Dr. Moore stood in my apartment hallway, her face flushed, hair a mess, looking harrowed and disturbed. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry, Amelia." I knew what she was going to say before she said it. "You have to go back in." I was in the simulation chamber, and this time it was for real. There's a part of you locked in there, Dr. Moore was repeating. A carbon copy. It was made, trapped, when you were in there past the hour. She looks like you, but she isn't you. She's it. I nodded. She'd given me the same speech on the drive up here. I was resigned, broken, so tired and ruined that I'd do anything to kill the nightmare once and for all. I didn't even argue when she showed up at my place. Just joined her for the hour ride north. You find her, you kill her, we pull you out, Dr. Moore said. They'll know when she's close. You'll sense it. I pulled a deep breath, knowing that her proposal was easier said than done. The apologetic tint in her eyes said that she knew too. Find her and kill her, Dr. Moore told me one last time. Then the simulation chamber sucked shut, and I went tumbling into the nightmare. There's a part of you locked in there, Dr. Moore had said to me just before I was blasted into hell. A carbon copy. It was made, trapped, when you were in there past the hour. She looks like you, but she isn't you. She's it. Find her and kill her. But she had said something else too, something that froze the blood in my veins, and my heart mid-pump. You've spent too much time in the simulation already, she continued, far beyond what's acceptable for anyone. If you spend much longer in there. She paused, her face screwing up. You have 15 minutes, Amelia. 15 minutes to find your counterpart and kill her before. But instead of finishing her thought, she pressed an old-fashioned stopwatch into my palm. Then the chamber was hissing shut, and I was spiraling down, barreling through a great black abyss into the unknown, the nightmare waiting for me just beyond, and how it was hard to breathe. God, how it was, and I was dizzy, and sick and screaming, but I couldn't hear it, and then I was in a junkyard, the ticking stopwatch in hand. 14 minutes, and 30 seconds left. I sheathed it in my pocket, and looked around. Moonlight winked off splintered windshields, gleamed off rusted bumpers. Great mountains of cars, some condensed into neat little cubes, others torn and shredded but mostly intact, rose around me in biblical scale, stretching to and fro. As far as I could see, it was an endless orchard of Mount Everest, forged from the dead husks of rusted-out jalopies and gutted-out pickups. It was awesome and otherworldly. It was. Find her and kill her. It was nightmarish and cold. A shiver bit through my bones. Metal creaked and moaned as a sharp wind soaked through the car graveyard. Dirt pathways cut narrow valleys through the range of metal mountains, piles of twisted steel, and broken glass standing out against an icy night sky. Then I heard something, low and tiny, tucked into the hoot of wind. It was a scraping, clicking noise, like nails, so many tiny nails, playing over metal. Then the squeaking came, low at first, building into a mass cacophony, frenzied and skin-crawling, of rodents chittering in psycho chorus. It sounded like a flash flood of rats cascaded out of the ruined cars, squeezing and forcing their way out into the open. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands, a flowing river of squeaking, wriggling fur, their tails pink and awful, their teeth sharp and rabid. They drew out into the pathway and surged toward me, so many of them that it forced the appearance of a great rush of liquid fur, pouring forward to devour me bite for bite. My heart froze, and then unfroze with two rapid crash thuds. My lungs squeezed tight, my legs crawled with disgusting goose flesh. Their smell was suffocating. The reek of fur, damp and ripe, seemed to fill my lungs and choke out all the air. I felt my stomach screw into a knot. Something warm ran down my leg, a trickle of piss. I'd lost my bladder. My mind galloped back to the time that I was 8 and had awoken to a warm bundle tucked over my throat. A giant, attic-bound rat had slithered out of its dark home and taken bed on my tender, delicate neck. Ever since, no, I had to move. The rats were closing in, more joining the flood every second, pouring out on either side of me, leaping and bouncing forward, their tight lips drawn over bone-white teeth that were needle-sharp and ready to bite. I sucked air. My heart crashed through my ribs. I forced life into my bones. I turned and ran like hell. I ran, but the rat river ran faster. A blur of warped and twisted metal zipped by. Rats squeezed out of blown-out headlights, and exhaust pipes gnawed through deflated tires and exposed upholstery, all of them joining the raging flash flood that was roaring after me. Up ahead, my dirt path met a T-junction, hitting a mountain of cars and splitting off to the left and right. Then, wham, a wall of rats came seething in from either side, filling out into an apocalyptic tsunami of hateful, furry forms. They rode each other in waves, boiling forward in a cloud of awful chitters. I was trapped, the rat river rushing in from both ends, burning through the path, and leaving me nothing spare the dirt in which I stood. I spun, searching for a way out, my heart racing, pounding, lungs aching, the air thick with rodent reek, mountains of cars blocking me in, a flood of rats crushing closer. I was filled with a tight elemental terror, like a white-hot poker had been jammed through my stomach and left there to sizzle. My throat crawled as I watched the mass of scampering rodents seethe in on me, filling my view. Then a flash of faded orange snapped by on my periphery, a color I knew like my first kiss. I planted my feet and lunged. That color, a sun-bleached cross between pumpkin and beige, belonged to the trunk of my first car, an old hatchback with mismatched doors and duct-taped seats. And it was my car, not just a doppelganger. A peeling bumper sticker I knew all too well stood out against the smog-blasted bumper. I grabbed the latch, felt it click beneath my fingers, and flung the trunk wide, just as the rat river collided behind me. And then I was engulfed in a living ball of squirming, hot fur. They clawed through my hair, probed their hot snouts up my ears, writhed through my arms and legs. They scrabbled up at me, needling at my legs with their dreadful carved teeth. Blinding flashes of pain sang up my thighs as the massive rats tore scraps of warm flesh from my bones. I screamed and forced myself into the trunk space, kicking and pounding at the creatures starving for my living flesh. I fought most of them free, stomping and crushing their glassy bones, crunching them dead as I negotiated my body, which seemed too heavy and not like my own, into the trunk. I pressed myself down and slammed the lid shut, sealing out the scraping, clicking nails of the great rat river. It was a roar of squeaks and clicks, deafening in the claustrophobic trunk. But I didn't have time to despair. My legs were screaming. A warm puddle of blood was collecting in the trunk beneath me. I could feel my legs being worked, gnawed, as two tenacious rodents ate their fill. I pawed blindly and felt a warm pouch of fur on my leg. With a cry of disgust, I wrenched it up and squeezed until bone popped beneath my fingers, and the blood-soaked rat fell limply away. I felt for the second, desperate to be free of it. It chittered and snapped at my hand. A flash of pain bolted up my arm. I screamed and kicked at the thing, trapping it beneath my shoe and the wall. I felt its anatomy crackle, crunching down into a loose ball of flesh as it squealed and writhed. I pressed harder, grinding the ball of my foot against the awful rodent until I felt it burst and send a hot rush of expended guts running down my right leg. The awful, slimy goop collected in my pants, my shoes, soaking my socks with rat blood. I gagged and fought back a spray of vomit which came up anyway, splattering the trunk and filling it with the sour reek of sick. I shuddered, spit, wiped my mouth, maneuvered my body, and kicked forward the backseat of my first car. My car wasn't trapped beneath a mountain of steel and rubber, it was in a tunnel. Fenders and headlights and wheels and trunks textured the darkness around me as if the narrow, one-lane pass was burrowed through the endless sea of junk vehicles. At the end of the tunnel stood a strange collage of light. It almost looked like a circus, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw it was a circus, warm and inviting, lulling me with faint calliope music and the smell of peanuts and popcorn. I reached for the ignition, no doubt in my mind that my hand would find the key. It did. My old car growled to life, humming beneath me, ready to roll. I eased my foot on the gas. Metal scraped and clawed at my hatchback as I withdrew from the crowd of cars stacked above and around me. They collapsed down with a tremendous report, filling out the gaps as I pulled out and off, trundling up the tunnel, headed for the circus. I stood in the empty circus with 5 minutes to go. It was endless, I mean literally endless. Striped tents and carny carriages stretched as far in every direction as I could see across an infinite grassy plain. It was abandoned, the lights still flashing, and the smell of fried dough still warm and sweet in the air, as if only moments before the attendees and performers had just vanished. I felt eyes crawling over my skin and turned. I saw no one. Feeling vulnerable, I started walking, briskly, my head roving, eyes scanning the tents. My car had died as I exited the tunnel. The engine gave a long, mournful sigh and then ground to a stop, forcing me to continue on foot. 4 minutes. I looked at the stopwatch, ticking down, burning away the little time I had left. And what happened if the time ran out? I didn't know and didn't want to find out, so I continued on, hurrying, scanning, not sure where I was supposed to go. I felt lost and dizzy, surrounded by that endless circus which reminded me so much of an infinity mirror. 3 minutes. I stared at the stopwatch. How is that possible? Just a second ago it had been at 4. Without thinking, I started to run, my feet sinking through grass and pounding me up identical rows of tents and rides, all of them painted with garish colors that spoke of clowns and strongmen and acrobats and magicians. I ran harder, the wind yanking at me, burning my eyes until they bled salt. 2 minutes. I stopped, turned, spun, lost and confused, shipwrecked in an ocean of tents. And then I saw it and jerked to a stop, hauling air through my bruised chest, staring at the haunted house on the hill, knowing that was where I was supposed to go. The midway curved suddenly up, swelling into a low hill that bore a crooked manor, dark and ugly in its disrepair, lifeless, and yet pulsing with something beyond life. It was 2 stories and gray, so gray, like its timber was sick, and its cloudy windows, which looked to me like so many eyes, were sick, too. I didn't want to go into that place, wander its tenebrous halls and shadow-soaked staircases. It was a house for which haunted houses were named, but I didn't have time. The stopwatch was ticking away, swallowing up the little time I had left with each stutter of the second hand. Without thinking, I fell into a run. The tents shifted into a blur of color as I ground up the hill, my legs aching and bleeding, my brain ratcheting through my skull, expanding and ballooning until the whole world was warped and blurred. I staggered up the porch which creaked underfoot, brushed away a sheet of cobweb, gripped the great brass door handle, and pushed into the buttery warmth of an 18th century masquerade ball. Dozens of masked guests, men in tuxedos, and women in luxurious gowns, moved in silent tandem, sweeping through the Baroque candlelit space to the music in their heads. It was deadly silent, spare the shuffle of feet, a sound like insects crawling through a hive, so pointedly wrong that it made my skin crawl. A great carpeted staircase swooped up from the far end of the room, feeding up into the darkened second floor. I knew that was where I was meant to go. 1 minute. I started through the sea of people, made it a quarter of the way through before a man gripped my hands and pulled me into a step and shift dance. His mask was fashioned of gore, lumps of human skin crudely stitched together into the infamous drama mask, a drooping frown forced into the folds, 2 teardrop-shaped eye holes framing shadow. I gasped and jerked free and continued fighting through the mess of bodies, all dancing, shuffling, their masks growing progressively worse, some of them blank and glassy and plainly horrific, others leaving me unsure if they were masks at all. 50 seconds. The crowd thickened. As I drew deeper, a suffocating crush of bodies, suddenly sweeping me in like a riptide and pulling me back away from the stairs. I struggled but was only pulled further, caught in this moving mess of human quicksand, trapped between a half-dozen gowns and tuxedos, masks flashing by, horrific grins, and manic eyes. An elbow caught me in the ribs, folded me in half. Another came in and barked off my forehead. I was jostled, manhandled, bounced around. All I could do was scream. As soon as I did, the candles on the chandelier doused in a puff of smoke, and the room erupted into silence, a deep, suffocating silence. I was alone. The dancers were gone and I was alone. I stood up, the ticking watch in hand, and saw that the room had transformed into rotten mess of scabbed wallpaper and cobweb furnishings, everything filmed in an inch of dust. It had transformed into a haunted house. I found my counterpart in the laboratory with 15 seconds to go. It looked like a mad scientist. Crazy cave, tables of complicated inventions, all wires and levers, lined tables under the guttering light of gas lanterns. Amelia was there. I was there, wearing a hospital slip. Find her and kill her. She, me, was shackled to an operating table, bound and gagged, thrashing in her binds. When she saw me, her eyes went wide and bright with terror. She struggled against her fetters, wrenching her arms and legs to no avail. 10 seconds. I moved beside her, stood over her. She was trying to speak through the ball gag jammed down her throat like an apple in the mouth of a Christmas pig. Muted syllables came out. Nothing I could decipher. I couldn't do this. I looked away. 5 seconds. Dr. Moore's voice echoed through my head. Find her. I saw a rusty scalpel on a nearby table, tucked between a robotic homunculus and the blueprints for a Da Vinci-esque flying machine. And kill her. I grabbed the scalpel without thinking. 3 seconds. Raised the weapon over my facsimile, my hands shaking. Heard thudding. Tears salting my cheeks. 2 seconds. She stared up at me, pleading with her eyes, desperately shaking her head, trying to speak through her gags. Myself. 1 second. I jammed the scalpel through the other Amelia's chest. It disappeared through fabric and skin, crunching through bone as it pierced her warm, pounding heart. She screamed through her gag, her face nodding with agony, a thin flower of blood blooming through her hospital gown. Then she began to waste away, her skin wrinkling, drying, sucking down against her bones as it lost its moisture, leaving her nothing but dust in the empty white slip. I was crying, sobbing, my hands holding the bloody scalpel. The stopwatch was beeping, screaming in my ear, and then I felt pain, a dull throbbing in my chest, low at first, building into a white-hot flare of agony that flooded my ribcage like molten lava. Did you really think it'd be that easy? The voice behind me chuckled. I tried to turn, but I couldn't. I was covered in glue, and my clothes were wet, my shirt sticky and warm. I looked down. My hands were gripping the scalpel I'd jammed through my chest. The world split in two, and I fell forward, taking a few of the tabletop inventions with me as I grappled for leverage. I thudded to the floor, cracking my head off nicotine-stained linoleum. Blood pooled beneath me, and in its black reflection I saw myself standing above me, the other me, the one I was supposed to kill, but couldn't, smiling, laughing, her eyes gleaming with heinous amusement. I tried to speak, but my mouth was filled with hot copper. I coughed blood as a warm, safe darkness rippled in on the edges of my vision, swallowing my view to a pinprick. She was howling laughter, a sound that was mine, and not mine at all. Then the world went black. Then the world went white. A blinding, searing white burned my eyes as the simulation chamber pulled open, and I awoke from the nightmare once and for all. I groped my way out, collapsed to the floor, put a hand on the belly of the chamber to steady myself, and when I took it away there was a smear of blood. I looked down at myself. I was soaked in blood, drenched in it, gowned in it, the scalpel sticking from my chest. It's okay, Amelia, Dr. Moore said. I'll fix you right up. I looked up, slowly, from her reserved slacks to that starched lab coat, then up to her head, which was not a head at all but a box, a rusty, perforated box like that impossible thing I'd seen on the first trip. Fix you right up. Then she hissed, and a cloud of spiders exploded from out of the box, filling the laboratory, and despite the hot agony I felt all over, I screamed. I screamed until my mouth filled with spiders, and they flooded my lungs, and I screamed no more. And when I was pulled out of the nightmare, for real, I was covered not with blood, but sweat, that skin-tight seal suit clinging to me like a disease. I was surrounded by an army of lab coats. They parted like the white sea as Dr. Moore forced her way through. I didn't kill her, was all I could croak. Dr. Moore looked at me, alarmed, slightly confused. Kill who? She asked. I looked up at the clock. It was 2:59. It was the day before, and I'd only been in the chamber for less than an hour. I've been chain smoking in the Ryan Labs parking lot. While I dictate my story, it's all I can do to try and make sense of my story. My world is broken, fractured. They told me that it was all part of the simulation, that I was never pulled out, that there was no malfunction. I'm not sure I believe them. Find her and kill her. I'm tired. My bones feel brittle under skin. That's much too tight. I've seen things already, shadows that move on the corners of my eyes, shapes that blur by and disappear. When I turn to look, I can't help but wonder if I'm still in the chamber. And the real me, my body, is locked on the outside in an induced state of rest, asleep in a cylinder somewhere far away, while my mind is left to scream. I don't know anymore. I just don't know.